Have you ever felt lost in the midst of despair, questioning the purpose of your suffering? The story of Job is a powerful testimony to how faith can transform the deepest anguish into renewed hope. In this video, we will tell the story of the life of Job, a man who, despite facing devastating losses and extreme suffering, found redemption and unimaginable blessings through his unwavering faith in God. Get ready to be inspired by a narrative that touches the heart and shows that even in the deepest darkness, the light of hope in God can shine through. But before we start, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of the content on this channel. Now on to today's story. There was a man who lived in the land of Uz, a prosperous and fertile region, rich in green fields and abundant herds. This man was Job. He was one of the richest men in the East, possessing an unimaginable fortune. His fields were always full of life, with thousands of sheep grazing peacefully, camels crossing the vast plains, oxen working hard on the land, and sturdy donkeys transporting goods. Job's wealth was not only measured by his material possessions, but also by the size of his heart and his unwavering faith in God. Job was blessed with a large family. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, each more beloved than the last. His children were close-knit and often got together to celebrate and share moments of joy, strengthening family ties. These gatherings were marked by feasts and banquets that filled Job's house with life. Despite his enormous wealth and the responsibilities that came with it, Job always found time for his family, showing love and care at all times. The respect that Job commanded in his community was immense. His neighbors and acquaintances admired him not only for his wealth, but also for his integrity and generosity. Job was known for helping those in need, always offering a helping hand to those in difficulty. His kindness and justice were recognized by all, and many came to him for advice and guidance. He was a pillar of his community, someone whom everyone trusted and admired. More important than his material wealth was Job's faith. He was a deeply devout man who dedicated his life to serving God. Every day, Job offered sacrifices not only for himself, but also for his children. He did this with the intention of purifying his family, fearing that they might have sinned in their hearts. Job's practice reflected his devotion and reverence for God, showing that his faith was the basis of his life. Job lived a life of obedience and reverence. He followed God's commandments with fervor and did not stray from the path of righteousness. His life was an example of how material wealth could be combined with a rich and fulfilling spiritual life. He didn't allow his prosperity to corrupt his soul. On the contrary, he used his resources to do good and honor God in all his actions. Job's daily life was a harmonious blend of hard work, spiritual devotion, and family joy. His days began early, with him overseeing the activities on his property, making sure everything was running smoothly. After a day's work, he would devote himself to his family, taking part in celebrations and looking after their needs. At the end of the day, Job would set aside a special time for his prayers and sacrifices, keeping his sacred bond with God strong. In his community, Job was seen as an example to be followed. His life showed that it was possible to be extremely prosperous without losing the essence of goodness and faith. He was a leader, a mentor, and a friend to many, always willing to share his wisdom and resources. His home was a haven of peace and security, a place where everyone knew they would be welcomed and cared for. This was the prosperous life of Job, a man whose wealth was surpassed only by his faith and integrity. He lived a full life, surrounded by love, respect, and divine blessings, always grateful for everything God gave him. But, as we shall see, this life of abundance and devotion would be tested in unimaginable ways, revealing the true depth of his faith and perseverance. On an apparently ordinary day in Job's life as he went about his daily devotion, something extraordinary and dark happened in heaven. In the heavenly courts, where angels and divine beings gathered, Satan, the adversary, stood before God. With a look of defiance, Satan argued that Job's faith and devotion were superficial, sustained only by the immense prosperity that God had given him. He insinuated that if Job lost everything, his faithfulness would fade quickly. God, being sovereign and knowing Job's heart, allowed Satan to test his faithfulness. However, God set a limit. Satan could touch everything Job owned, but he could not physically harm him. And so, with a subtle nod of divine permission, the wheels of misfortune began to turn. In a single day, terrible and unimaginable calamities befell Job. First, messengers came in haste, bringing news that the Sabaeans had attacked and taken away his oxen and donkeys, killing all the servants who looked after them. As soon as he had finished hearing this message, another messenger arrived, his eyes wide with terror, reporting that a fire from heaven, perhaps a devastating bolt of lightning, had burnt his sheep and the shepherds who guarded them. Before Job could process this second catastrophe, another messenger came running, almost out of breath, to report that the Chaldeans, divided into 3 bands, had attacked and taken his camels, killing the servants with the sword. With each new piece of news, the feeling of despair deepened in Job's heart, as if a dark and heavy shadow was descending over his life. But the worst news was yet to come. The last messenger, with tears in his eyes and a trembling voice, reported that Job's sons and daughters, who were gathered in his older brother's house, had been hit by a strong desert wind. The wind blew the house down, killing everyone inside. This was the most devastating of losses, taking from Job not only his wealth, but his very blood, his descendants, his future. In the midst of this immeasurable pain and despair, Job did something surprising and profound. He tore his clothes as a sign of mourning, shaved his head, and instead of cursing God, as Satan had predicted, Job fell to the ground and worshipped. With unshakable faith, he uttered words that would echo down the centuries. "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Despite losing everything, Job neither sinned nor blamed God. His response of faith and absolute submission to the Lord is one of the most powerful demonstrations of integrity and devotion in biblical history. This moment marked the beginning of a series of trials that would test Job's faith to its limits, but also show the world the depth of his belief and the greatness of his character. Satan, still unsatisfied with Job's impressive resilience, decided that there must be a way to break his faith. Again, he presented himself before God, arguing that if Job lost his health, he would surely renounce God. God, trusting deeply in Job's integrity and faith, allowed Satan to afflict him on one condition: he could touch Job's health, but not take his life. And so a new and terrible test began. Job was stricken with a painful disease that covered his entire body with purulent ulcers, from his head to his feet. These open sores were extremely painful and irritating, making any movement a constant agony. Job, in his misery, sat on a pile of ashes, a symbol of mourning and humiliation, and used a pottery shard to scrape his wounds in a desperate attempt to relieve some of his pain. His situation was so deplorable that even his wife, seeing the state he was in, suggested that he curse God and die, thus freeing himself from all suffering. However, Job, maintaining his integrity, replied, "You speak like a fool. Shall we accept good from God and not evil?" He refused to sin with his lips even in the face of this extreme adversity. News of Job's condition soon spread, and his 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, came from afar to comfort him. When they arrived and saw the extent of his suffering, they could hardly recognize him. In a gesture of empathy and respect, they tore their clothes, threw dust over their heads, and sat with Job in silence for 7 days and 7 nights, because they saw that his pain was too great for words. Finally, after this period of silence, Job's friends began to speak. However, instead of offering the consolation and empathy he so desperately needed, they began to accuse him of sin. Eliphaz was the first to speak, suggesting that Job should confess any evil he had committed because, in his view, such suffering could only be the result of sin. Bildad and Zophar followed suit, insisting that Job should repent so that God could restore him. These accusations, although painful, did not shake Job's faith. He defended his innocence and cried out for justice, hoping that God would give him a hearing so that he could make his case. Job questioned divine justice, not out of despair, but out of a deep desire to understand the purpose of his suffering. He kept his faith, even when all seemed lost, and his soul was tormented not only by physical pain, but also by the misunderstanding and harsh words of his friends. This period of personal suffering and illness was one of the most difficult in Job's life. His endurance and faith were tested to the extreme. but he stood firm and did not sin against God. Understanding the dialogues and questions of Job and his friends better, it was 7 days of silence at Job's side, as we have already said, when his friends finally decided to speak. This began a prolonged period of intense debate about justice and the nature of God. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, each in turn, presented their perspectives on why Job was suffering so much. For them, the answer was clear and simple. Job must have sinned in some way, because in their view, God is just and only allows suffering to fall on sinners. Eliphaz began by saying that the innocent don't suffer like that, and that Job should repent in order to find relief. Job, in his deep distress, listened patiently to his friends but could not accept their conclusions. He knew in his heart that he had not committed any transgression that would justify such a punishment. In the midst of his pain, Job questioned the reason for his suffering, calling for a direct audience with God to understand his fate. He expressed his doubts and anguish in powerful and poetic terms, lamenting the day of his birth and wishing that his life had never begun. The discussion with his friends became a cycle of accusations and defenses. Bildad accused Job of speaking arrogantly, insisting that God would not pervert justice and that Job's children had been punished for their own sins. Job replied, saying that God is powerful and no one can fully understand him, but he still longed for a direct meeting with the Creator to plead his innocence. Zophar, the third friend, was even harsher, suggesting that Job was getting less than he deserved and that he should purify himself in order to find relief. In all these dialogues, Job maintained his integrity. He refused to accept that he deserved such punishment, insisting that he had committed no sin that would justify his suffering. He questioned God's justice, not in rebellion, but in a sincere search for understanding. Job wanted to understand the reason for his anguish, and this search for understanding led him to challenge his friends' assumptions. It was then that Elihu, a young bystander who had remained silent until then, decided to intervene. He was angry both with Job for justifying himself more than God, and with the three friends for failing to prove Job wrong. Elihu offered a new perspective, suggesting that suffering could serve to shape and refine character, and not necessarily as a direct punishment for sin. He argued that God speaks in various ways, including through suffering, to teach and correct. Elihu brought a view that Job's suffering could be God's means of testing and strengthening his faith, rather than a punishment. He stressed that God is greater than human understanding, and that man must trust in divine wisdom, even when he cannot fully understand God's ways. Elihu insisted that Job should accept that God was speaking to him through his trials, and that he should trust in God's justice and mercy. The dialogues and questions between Job, his friends, and Elihu were a profound exploration of faith, justice, and the nature of God. These conversations revealed the complexity of the human experience of suffering and the search for meaning in the midst of pain. Job, despite his suffering and the accusations of his friends, as we have said, remained steadfast in his faith and his search for answers, demonstrating a resilience and integrity that would continue to be admired for generations. After a long period of suffering and questioning, the moment Job had longed for finally arrived. God answered him, and God didn't do it in the ordinary way, but in a grand and imposing way. From within a whirlwind, a majestic and powerful storm, God's voice echoed, full of authority and wisdom. Job, who had cried out for a direct audience with the Creator, now found himself before the divine majesty. God, however, did not offer Job a direct explanation as to why he was suffering. Instead, God asked a series of rhetorical questions that highlighted the vastness and complexity of creation, something that was far beyond human comprehension. He asked Job where he was when the foundations of the earth were laid, whether he could command the mornings or the seas, or whether he had the power to control the constellations of the sky. With each question, God emphasized his infinite wisdom and power, showing Job the greatness and complexity of the universe he governed. Job, faced with the greatness of God's words, realized the immensity of his own ignorance. He recognized his smallness before the vastness of God's knowledge and wisdom. Humbly, Job responded to God, saying, "I know that you can do everything, and that none of your plans can be thwarted. That's why I spoke of things I didn't understand, things too wonderful for me, things I didn't know. My ears had already heard about you, but now my eyes have seen you. For this I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." Job's statement was a profound recognition of his human limitations and of God's sovereignty. He understood that not everything can be understood by the human mind and that faith involves trusting in God's wisdom and purpose, even when we can't fully understand what is happening in our lives. In response to Job's humility and unwavering faith, God restored his fortunes in an extraordinary way. God gave Job twice as much as he had before. If before Job had 7,000 sheep, now he had 14,000. If before he had 3,000 camels, now he had 6,000. His oxen and donkeys also doubled in number. In addition, God blessed Job with 7 more sons and 3 more daughters, equaling the number of children he had lost. These new daughters were the most beautiful in all the land, and Job treated them with great honor, giving them inheritance along with their brothers, something unusual in the culture of that time. Job's restoration was not only material, but also emotional and spiritual. He saw his family grow again and experience the joy of a full and blessed life. Job lived a long life after his restoration. He saw his children, his grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and even great-great-grandchildren. He lived to a ripe old age, full of days, and died in peace, surrounded by his family and his restored wealth. Job's story is not just about suffering and restoration, but about the depth of faith and trust he had in the living God, even in the most difficult times. Job's journey continues to inspire and teach valuable lessons about perseverance, humility, and unwavering faith in the face of life's adversities, knowing that God is in control of all things, even the most adverse situations.